Okay, great. This is a really interesting experience doing this from my room, but I just wanted to say good afternoon. Thank you all so much for taking the time to not only join us for virtual AIDS Watch, but for giving us your time to continue to show up in the midst of some very, very interesting and slightly uncharted territory for all of us. My name is Julio Fonseca, as I had mentioned before, and I'm a senior program manager at AIDS United. And I am joined today by one of my fabulous colleagues, Alex Vance.
Hey everybody, I'm Alex Vance, Senior Policy Manager with AIDS United.
And so, thank you, Alex, coming through loud and clear. We just wanted to say thank you, again, for joining us. We know that there's a lot of new variables in our life right now, and we've been able to very quickly sort of turn this around. I think it's, oh, there I am. Hi. So hi, Alex. Sporting the slightly different colored, this is what it looks like, shirts in solidarity with all the folks who've joined us this afternoon. Thank you so much. Before we kind of dig in, we really wanted to just sort of quickly, if we can go to the next slide, each tell you a little bit about ourselves. So I'll let Alex start.
Sure. So I have been with AIDS United now for almost 2 years on the staff, working in the policy department. Looking at the attendee list of this webinar, I've worked with many of you, and I'm really excited to see a whole bunch of new names that I don't know. It tells me that our community is continuing to grow, and that's really exciting. A little bit about my background. So I've been living with HIV for about 11 years now. And when I was diagnosed, I had no idea what to do. I was working at a bank at that time and really kind of hating my job. But it paid the bills, so I stayed. But I had always been a volunteer at HIV and LGBTQ organizations across the US South. I'm from Alabama. So that's kind of how I was brought up. My mom was a huge volunteer, and she brought me along, raised me in that kind of way. So it's always been part of my fabric as a person, and that continued. After some long talks with my therapist at the time and a lot of my friends on what to do in this new era of my life, I decided to lean into that background, that upbringing of advocacy and storytelling and volunteering. So I started volunteering at an AIDS service organization called AIDS Alabama, doing testing and education events, and then eventually started volunteering in their policy department. And I was part of their first, what they call a Positive Leadership Council, which was a program funded jointly by Elton John AIDS Foundation and AIDS United that empowers people living with HIV with advocacy skills and some targeted education. So that I kind of was in that for 3 years, and then a position opened up at AIDS Alabama for the Director of Policy and Advocacy. And I went out on a limb. I'd never worked at a nonprofit before, went out, and Kathy Hires chose me, and it was great. And I worked with AIDS United at that point in time as part of their Public Policy Council, and that work kind of has just never stopped since then. I've now since relocated to Washington, D.C., and have been on the team in AIDS United, like I said, for about 2 years. I think that's enough about me for now, though. Your turn, Julio.
So thanks, Alex. So Alex, I met initially when Alex was a grantee of People Organizing Positively. Really quickly about myself, I have been living with HIV now for 11 years and a month. Initially, I never sort of anticipated that I would be as vocal and as open about my experiences, but I had such a tremendous amount of support when I initially got my diagnosis that I really wanted to do something that felt meaningful, involving, you know, a lot of sort of outreach and help with the community. So initially I volunteered as a mentor to newly diagnosed people. And then ultimately about 4.5 years ago, landed at AIDS United as a part of the People Organizing Positively initiative. I was not out about my status for a very long time publicly. And then once I came out, I just sort of dug into kind of the work that we do and really felt a sense of sort of liberation and power in being able to share my story and being able to have my story connect for other people who maybe were at various sort of parts of the disclosure, you know, spectrum about whether or not they wanted to dig in and do this work. And so with all of the folks that are on today, we know that you're showing your level of commitment now, because, you know, you could very easily, you know, be doing something else, but here you are, and participating in this as we sort of learn how to do this in a new sort of, not new virtual space, but in a way that we're sort of adapting in real time to kind of what's going on. So with that, again, really glad that you all are committed to doing, you know, this work, and it's great to see so many familiar names. I wish we could see your faces, but that would completely probably overwhelm us. Me with gratitude, because I want to hug everybody and I haven't been able to hug anybody in like 2 weeks. So virtual hugs to everybody, and we'll go ahead and get started. So I think, you know, and Alex and I kind of touched on this in our own sort of stories, you know, both coming from families with volunteer backgrounds and sort of wondering, and thank you, moderator, for advancing to the next slide. You know, a lot of times I think that it's really hard when there's so much noise and so much sort of, you know, resources that people are trying to allocate and move towards and try to make space for. And, you know, a lot of times you can really feel like, gosh, you know, can I really make a difference? Can my story, can my experience and strength and kind of hope make a difference and move the needle in the movement at all? And the answer is always yes. Your voice and your story have power. They're yours and they're unique to what's brought you into this movement, into this engagement. Sharing your experiences can really help other folks who may not be ready to speak or may not be able to speak or feel comfortable speaking yet. It's important because you can ensure that your rights are upheld and that important issues that impact you and members of your fellow community don't go unnoticed. And one thing I like to stress is, you know, if this is your first AIDSWatch and if you're new to sort of this space, don't be scared or intimidated. You know, none of us came out of the box and unwrapped from the plastic, you know, doing this perfectly. And there's still a lot of times when, you know, we may be presenting or doing different things where there's always room for improvement and development. But we all started at a certain point, and everybody, you know, has that experience and value and can bring it to bear in the way that you see fit that's meaningful for you. Next slide.
So Julio, you're absolutely right that none of us come out of the box or the plastic ready to go. I know that I certainly didn't. And especially when it comes to advocating for legislative or policy change. I've done a lot of learning and growing over the years, and I continue to do that. We've had to learn how to talk about HIV in a different way with this ending the HIV epidemic initiative the federal government is embarking on right now. And now we're even learning how to talk about COVID, kind of building the plane as it flies. But something a question that I hear a lot is, well, I work for a nonprofit and we get we're funded by the federal government, so we can't lobby. One thing, and what I want to say to that is that all lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. It's kind of like squares and rectangles. You can do a lot of things. You can engage with federal decision makers without it being considered lobbying. You can educate members of Congress or members of state, local, or federal administrations about specific policy issues without it veering into lobbying. I could go further in depth into the IRS tax code about how nonprofits are allowed to lobby up to a certain extent, but that's not the purpose of this. Regardless of what funding you receive, if you happen to work for a nonprofit organization, you are able to advocate and to engage with decision makers without jeopardizing that funding or jeopardizing your employment or your employer. So I just wanted to put that out there so everyone is a bit more comfortable. So next slide, please. We'll talk about the difference between advocacy and the two different types of lobbying. So advocacy, as we see here, is educating and raising awareness among legislators and the public around specific issues. And this can be done in a ton of different ways. Tweet storms, calling folks on the phone, visiting people in their offices and providing educational materials to them either on your own or at their request. When advocacy becomes lobbying is when you ask a legislator to take a specific position around a piece of legislation. So if we're looking at the coronavirus relief package that was passed last week, advocacy would be talking to a legislator about why it's important to provide funding and relief for various health sectors and for individuals who are experiencing hardship because they're currently not employed. It becomes lobbying when you ask your representative or one of your senators to either vote yes or vote no. You are talking to a legislator about a specific piece of legislation and asking them to take a specific stance. That's when it becomes lobbying. So direct lobbying is when you yourself directly ask that legislator to take a specific position on a piece of legislation. Grassroots lobbying, on the other hand, is when you encourage the public to ask a legislator to take a specific stance around a piece of legislation. So it's really about who is doing the asking. If it's you yourself, then that's direct. If you are asking other people to do it for you or with you, which I hope it is with you always, then it'd be grassroots lobbying. Next slide.
So we wanted to just talk a little bit about, different levels of advocacy. And I think a lot of times it's important to kind of recenter and realize that, we do a lot of advocacy and that we've done a lot of advocacy in our lives and in our personal journeys that we can sort of build upon skill sets that we already have that maybe we don't acknowledge. I think the first and foremost example that's really important is individual and personal. And as Alex and I were preparing this last week, a couple of weeks ago when AIDS United went completely to telework, right before that, I reached out to my pharmacy and to my provider because I didn't know how long were we actually going to be in, the situation that we're in. And I wanted to make sure that I had, ample medication to not disrupt my treatment. And so, initially the pharmacist was, it's still that gray area where certain standards hadn't come out about, social distancing, et cetera. And the pharmacist was a little bit reluctant to FedEx my scripts to me. And I made it very, I had to be a little bit firm and advocate for myself and say that, I really felt that, if that was a service that they provided, that I wanted them to provide it. And ultimately, it ended up having a positive outcome for me because I don't have to worry about that for a period of time. So that's an example of individual and personal. Alex, you want to take community local?
Sure. So in the same vein of how we operate in this new world of social distancing, as individual states and jurisdictions move toward more extreme shelter-in-place proclamations or mandates, it's what I have been able to witness and participate in myself is a community and local response. And what that has looked like that I've been able to witness is twofold. The first is folks advocating for people who are able to help out elderly individuals or people who are homebound in getting their basic needs. So doing that advocacy on behalf of other folks. And the other is to advocate among your networks for people to stay at home as much as they're able to, unless it is to go out and get groceries or things of that nature. And that community level pressure is working. As we see communities engage in more strict and adhere to shelter in place recommendations and mandates, we are watching those curves flatten in real time. So there is a real effect that this community level advocacy is having.
And so then the next level is state, and I have kind of a rough example, but this morning, I believe it was this morning, the District of Columbia was allowed to receive federal emergency FEMA funding in response to the COVID-19 situation. And we were previously designated as a territory, so we received significantly less funding than other states for the stimulus package. And so I think that there was a lot of outcry that came from communities and folks that, mobilized behind our mayor and local representation to really sort of amplify the voice of why that wasn't fair. And so another funding mechanism that we had available to us was then accessed. And so I think that as sort of time goes on, as states sort of develop their own sort of response and plans and different levels of funding and engagement for support for communities, I think there's going to be a lot more opportunity for folks to, in real time, sort of mobilize and keep an eye on what is, helpful and what could potentially be harmful for communities living with HIV at the state level. Federal and national, that's why you're all, I started to say that's why you're all here. That's why you're all virtually here. You're not all in my one-room apartment, but that's why we're all here to collectively, collaborate on ensuring that legislation that comes from the federal government is actually in support of the communities and all of the communities that intersect within the HIV response. International, we don't really need to sort of delve into, but I think that it's important to know that there's a community of international advocates and folks that also are responding to some of the challenges and experiences that we're beginning to already see around the world with a global pandemic. Alex, did you have anything else on any of those?
Sure, I think you hit the nail on the head with federal and national. And since we don't often talk about international efforts, I would like to just give a little bit of a spotlight to that. We've seen two big examples of that recently. One is communities and governments pressing the World Health Organization to declare COVID a pandemic. The World Health Organization really pushed back on that for a while because that can cause a significant amount of alarm in the global population. But once they had enough governments and enough communities pressuring them to do so, they acquiesced and said, yes, this is a pandemic and it should be treated as such. Another example of that is the International AIDS Conference 2020. There were a large number of advocates in the US and across the globe who felt that the US was not the right host country currently under this administration to hold an international conference about the health of people living with HIV, people who use drugs, and people who engage in sex work. So they pressured the convening committee to move and ended up, before all of this COVID pandemic changed things, ended up deciding to have their own satellite conference that would be more accessible to community and hosted outside of the US. That would be called HIV 2020. HIV 2020 is now has now been canceled and is looking for a way to provide that kind of community input. And as David has noted in the chat function, AIDS 2020 will be completely virtual this year, and they have more information on their website now. They've reduced their registration costs, but it is still fairly expensive. So take a look at that when you have a moment. But thanks for indulging me with those two international examples, Julio.
Thank you for providing them, Alex. So really quickly, Alex just referenced the chat box and the Q&A. I have been keeping my eye on the Q&A, and it looks like Alex has been keeping his eyes on the chat box. And so we're going to try and leave some time to address some of those questions or any other questions that come up. Initially, as we usually do this, we usually have time for some sort of scenarios and the opportunity for folks to try and do a little bit of engagement. But we're going to try and set this up in a way that you're able to sort of practice on your own in your room, since, as we heard in the previous What's This Folder session, that there are at least 30 virtual meetings that are scheduled for tomorrow. And so we think that we have kind of some guidelines that might be helpful with that, without sort of taking up too much time from questions that folks may have. So yes, I mean, we've kind of delved into, you know, that your story does matter. I think that in a lot of times, I think it's a matter of figuring out how to nuance your story in a way that connects with policymakers and people that are actually representing your districts, so that they understand not only the value of your story, but what your ask is and what it means ultimately for them to take action. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today in the next upcoming slides. Next slide. So I think, Alex, was this you or me? I'm sorry.
That's you, and I'm the next one.
Okay. Thank you. So key steps to advocacy: identify the issue. What is it that you, your coalition, your organization, or your community is interested in addressing? Get educated, know your facts. This doesn't require an extensive, you know, costly sort of survey or any sort of other, like, those are fine for well-funded, you know, organizations that want to kind of throw money at that type of thing. But there are ways to get educated and to understand what exactly is happening in your community. Health department data that may be available, other AIDS service organizations that you partner with, or other community-based organizations that have access to data and trends. Anecdotes. I mean, a lot of times people stress quantitative over qualitative, but a lot of times the quest for qualitative comes because of the qualitative. Did I say that right? The search for numbers comes because of the stories, that part. I'm not really good with numbers, but stories and then being able to connect them to numbers is really, really helpful. You know, building support. Who are your coalition members, folks that you engage with, community partners who may be able to support you in terms of doing advocacy on the issue, making the ask, and who are some folks that you don't work with traditionally that might have, you know, an interest in this issue as well. I think in particular, you know, as sort of highlighted earlier today in the larger plenary, we talked about our national partnership, which has been very successful. And I mean, not to put Alex on the spot, but I'm putting you on the spot, to talk a little bit about kind of why that can also be sort of replicated locally in terms of building support.
Okay, I'm back. So can you restate, Julio?
Yeah, so I was just talking about building support and the reason why, you know, in particular in this current sort of environment where resources become scarce, why it's important to, you know, on the national level, we had an example this morning of how the national partnership is working towards advancing an agenda, and how that can be sort of accomplished also locally.
Sure. So we see that we hear this a lot, that local politics was going to affect your day-to-day life more than anything else. And I still firmly believe that that's true. So I have many examples of this in my work in Alabama, but one that I would like to lean on is the non-discrimination ordinance that I worked on in the city of Birmingham when I was running Equality Alabama, the statewide LGBTQ rights organization. And various coalitions had been trying to push the city government to pass such an ordinance for about a decade and really weren't getting anywhere. So when I took the helm at Equality Alabama, I did some interviews with local organizations that I thought would be part of that type of coalition. Faith-based organizations, the Chamber of Commerce, local police, and folks in those arenas, only to find out that they had not been engaged in this process at all over the past decade. And that to me told me immediately why that had not been successful. It didn't get the buy-in of the larger community that it would impact. So it came across as only being focused on LGBTQ rights, even though it was much more than that. Yes, queer organization and queer coalitions were pushing it primarily, but it was so much more than that. And once we were able to band together and build support in our own individual communities to collectively come together and be supportive of this effort, only then did the city see the need and give their support and finally pass that ordinance. So building that support in your own community first and linking up with allied communities or communities that share your interest is going to further that network and help you push whatever things you're advocating about.
And so I think that ties, thank you, Alex. I think that ties nicely into the next, piece is knowing your audience. So, knowing, is this policymaker or group of policymakers, what are their track records with the community? How do they feel about issues impacting the community? Do they perceive your issue one way, as Alex had just stated, when it's actually something more broadly, and how do you nuance that message? And it's also important to really kind of have an idea in terms of like making personal connections to kind of know who they are as people. I have multiple computers in front of me right now, but like we all have access to information. And so there's the opportunity to kind of look up, if you have, the access or know someone in your network or community that has access to, look up sort of the history or the biography of the policymaker or the legislator or the person that you're going to be talking to. Do they have a family? Do they have, an interest in your community other than, public policy, for example, other family members, et cetera. But ways that you can kind of maybe connect with them on a personal level as well. And then knowing kind of what the process is, where you are in the process. Does this require, is this like a 2-year type of situation? Is this a 1 year? When is the next legislative session happening? Do you have time to raise the awareness within the community? Next slide.
This is me. So there are a few things that go into creating what we're referring to as the best communication. So in our estimation, the best communication is personal. You don't have to be the main character in your story, but the listener should understand why you in particular are telling it. Why are you telling this story, and what personal experiences can you share to demonstrate real life impact? The best communication also has a clear goal. Why are you telling the story? What response do you hope to elicit from your audience, or what action would you like them to take? What is your ask? The best communication is tailored to a specific audience. Like we said before, you should know your audience, and the story you're telling should speak to the person you want to influence. It should elicit some kind of response in them. Who or what influences your audience's decision, and how does your goal align with their goals? The best communication is well-informed. An effective story includes compelling evidence. And that doesn't necessarily have to be you memorizing tons of numbers and statistics. Just whatever you're presenting should be compelling. It should leave a lasting mark and an impression so that whoever you're trying to influence will think about it later. Does the evidence support your objective? Is it relevant to your audience? And if you can remember a few facts and figures, what facts and figures can you connect with or provide the human aspect of? The best communication is clear and focused. Is your story organized logically? Does it have a beginning, middle, and end? Is it easy to follow? I have had to learn a lot over the years not to ramble or talk in circles, and I still have to tell myself to not do that. So think about that a lot. Think about staying clear and focused. What's helped me is to practice it myself into a mirror and time myself. You shouldn't ramble on for 10, 20, 30 minutes. Keep it short and sweet and make your point, which is the next point. The best communication is concise. If necessary, could you tell your story in 5 minutes? Could you tell it in 3 minutes? Could you possibly tell your entire story and get your ask out in 1 minute? What about 30 seconds in an elevator ride? Next slide.
So we know that folks are going to be jointly, there will be times when you'll be jointly making asks together. That's the ultimate goal too that we have, is to have a clear ask. So what is your story? How does it align with the message? And then what is the ask? It's important to make sure that everybody is aligned on the same message because it may be different people get to speak. Somebody may not get to speak, and that's not personal. That's just sometimes the nature of having very limited time with either a legislator or their aide or assistant. So it's really, really important to make sure that the underlying goal of what you're trying to accomplish is together and that the message is aligned. Next slide. So there's a couple of questions and answers in the Q&A box that I think kind of tie into what we're about to do. So I wanted to address them really quickly and kind of try and weave them out as examples of what we're going to talk about. So one of the questions is from Paul, and Paul's been living with HIV since 1988. This is your first AIDSWatch, welcome. The question is, how do you as a published essayist basically use chapters of your life living through the first pandemic of your life, use those in storytelling in a way that's going to be the most effective. And then we have another question that from Tom that says, you identify step 1 of advocacy as identifying the issue. The list of policy positions for today's event seems huge and overwhelming. Can you speak to the effectiveness for advocacy with Congress and focusing on 1 or 2 key issues versus working from the long list provided in the event package? So these are great questions because we're talking about really short amounts of time to actually engage with people, right? And so what we have is in the next slide, it's something that you can print out. Actually, I need to I'll make sure that we have sent out a copy of it or a version that you can kind of pull down. But it's the components of the elevator speech. So you've probably heard of this before. I think Alex just said it. So that's maybe where you heard it for the first time. But the elevator speech is a very clear, brief message or a commercial about who you are. I mean, it communicates who you are, what you're looking for, and it's about a minute long. That is such a brief period of time to try and get a lot of information in. So it's important to have kind of your asks ready, any materials that you have to present to the policymaker ready, something that goes more into detail with what the issue is ready to sort of hand over. But here's the components of the elevator speech. And I would encourage everybody, I've actually done this and I still do it from time to time when I know that I have a very brief period of time, to kind of write each of these subheadings out, like on a piece of paper, your name, what you do, your quick background of where you're from, why are you involved? And you know, what you're advocating on behalf of, and then ultimately what the ask is. So take those bullets, write them out, get your issue, 1 to 2 issues. And I think actually based on sort of what the need is in your community, and this goes to sort of Tom's question, what is the need in your community? You know, what is the group of people that you engage with in your community agree? These are maybe the top 2 things that we should talk about. And then distill that down into maybe, you know, writing out 2 different elevator speeches for each one. For Paul, you know, this sort of speaks to the bullet in terms of the bullets 2, 3, and 4. You know, this is what I do. This is my background, where I'm from. This is why I'm involved. And if you have published essays or things that you want to share with folks, that's something that you can use as a leave behind as well. Because I think that also, if you spark interest, the human interest sort of behind what the ask is important as well. So all of these elements you can write down and sort of flesh out into greater detail. And then, like Alex said, go in front of a mirror and set a timer and see how long it takes. It won't be perfect the first time, and you might feel silly, but you will get a sense of how you are engaging, what your facial cues are. Those are important, because when you have somebody's direct attention, which we don't, so I don't know if folks are rolling their eyes at me right now or not. I hope not. Little joke. You know, it's helpful to kind of see, though, how it is that you engage and how you communicate, and then kind of take that and infuse that into, is this too long? Do I need more? How much time did I spend on a certain section? Was my ask clear? Ultimately, that's the really, I think, important sort of takeaway is the ask clear? Next slide. Alex, we are at 2:07 and we have a number of questions in the chat box. Do you want to practice, or should we talk about virtual and then maybe get to some folks' questions?
Let's address things that we have not addressed in the chat box in the Q&A.
Okay.
And then send out another round for questions and to see if there are more. And then if we still have time, we can do a quick practice.
Okay, perfect. So we'll go into the next slide. So sharing your story virtually. Somebody had asked this question, and it was a good question, about giving suggestions about using Twitter linked videos to tell stories for advocacy. I love this question. So, because this was something that we had talked about last week. Since a lot of us have time on our hands, a bit more, I thought that it would be really interesting to sort of talk about the different platforms and what's available to you in terms of being able to communicate your messaging. As was referenced, Twitter, you are able to make 2-minute, 20-second videos, which for the interest of Twitter, I think might be a little bit long, actually. I know that sounds kind of, you know, like, what, 2 minutes long? But because people are sort of looking virtually so quickly at everything, it might be a good idea to take your elevator speech, do a practice round in the mirror, and then also like record it, film it, watch it back, see what you think, and that's the great thing about the medium that we are working in now, is that for those, we're able to, if it's not great, if you don't love it, if you trip up on a word, you can hit delete and do it again. But that's a great way to really sort of look at how to get that information out more broadly. We heard examples of Instagram as well. I really love Instagram. Some of you follow me on Instagram and you get to see that I'm kind of nuts. But basically my time in the house with Instagram has been just really helpful in terms of keeping myself sane. But there's an option in Instagram to do your post. And then you can also do like a story, which is a shorter version of your post. Each piece of the story is about 15 seconds, but you can take your actual Instagram post or video that tells your story, that has your ask, that has why you're doing this, and share it into your Instagram story for folks to be able to access. So I think that those are really ways, and you can get really creative too if you have time and the resources and the ability to sort of take the time to sort of really, really dig into how to like expand upon that virtual story, I think that's a great way to really make an impact. Don't be concerned about like numbers or perceived likes, etc. Just because somebody doesn't like it or you don't see that a number of people have liked it doesn't mean that it didn't get seen and doesn't mean that it didn't have a significant impact for somebody. You maybe just don't have the, you know, access to the metrics, but that's definitely a great way to handle that there. Do you have anything else on social media, Alex?
Sure. So I want to touch a little bit back on Tom's question. And Paul also is kind of talking about this as well in the chats. In the Q&A, like you read earlier, Tom asked, can you speak to the relative effectiveness of our advocacy with Congress of focusing on one or two key issues versus working from the long list provided in the event package? And then Paul goes on to say in the chat, are you going to talk about Twitter versus Facebook as far as impact? I'm quite Facebook savvy, not so much Twitter. I'm too verbose for Twitter, I think. So I want to address Paul's first. So originally Twitter was limited to 140 characters per message and didn't really have the built-in threading capabilities that it does now. So it was a little more difficult to get your message across than 140 characters, but Twitter eventually caved to public pressure, which was a community of online advocates coming together to pressure a platform to give them more voice. So Twitter has now 280 characters per tweet, and you can build a thread. And you see this a lot right now. If your Twitter feed looks anything like mine, you're seeing a lot of threads that have been retweeted or posted by people that you follow from medical professionals talking about their experience in their healthcare setting about with this COVID pandemic. And it's really fascinating stories. Some are really uplifting, some are really heartbreaking, but they tell a story and they get something across in sometimes one 280 character tweet, sometimes a stream of a thread of 4 or 5 tweets. So while you should still be concerned about keeping your message concise and clear, you may not necessarily need to be concerned about being too verbose on Twitter with its built-in capabilities of threading, and Twitter videos are also a great idea. My biggest piece of advice for that is if you're filming from your phone, don't have your phone like this in portrait. Have it landscape. It is easy. It fits into the user interface better, and is all around a much better experience for the viewer of your video, so they can see it without having to open it. They can just let it play and turn on the sound rather than having to open a video that's like this in portrait orientation. And if you open a video in portrait orientation, you can't see the text of the tweet that's with it. But if you keep it in landscape, your video, then you can see both the tweet and the video at the same time. So you can get a teaser message in your text and fully explain it in the up to 2 minutes and 20 seconds that you have. And this feeds into Tom's question about focusing on 1 or 2 key issues or working versus from the entire list. There's a lot that we're asking for at AIDSWatch this year. We asked for a lot last year and the year before that, and next year I'm sure we're going to be asking for even more as we learn more over the next year and as we dive further into this federal Ending the Epidemic initiative. As we learn from that, we're going to continue to ask for more resources, and to do that, we're going to have to be specific in our asks. So if you are particularly passionate about housing, that's something that I'm really, really passionate about. Kathy Hires has instilled that in me forever. Housing is healthcare, period. So that's something that I talk about a lot when I'm on the Hill or talking with other groups of advocates. So I generally try to zero in on that, and other folks who are in meetings with me talk about the Ryan White program or CDC STD prevention or the Minority AIDS Initiative Fund out of the Secretary's office or syringe exchanges, what have you. If you're particularly passionate about 1 or 2 things, take those things, because you'll be able to relate to them more. You'll be able to talk about them more effectively, and you won't be grasping for words. I am familiar with the Ryan White program because of the nature of this policy work, but I couldn't get into detail about Part F. I know what it's made up of and generally who it funds, but there are other people who are super passionate about AIDS education training centers and dental care and special projects of national significance who know a lot more about all three of those things than I ever will. But I am super passionate and know a lot about APWA, so I'm going to focus on that.
So I think that's another, Alex, that's another excellent point is, know your strengths. Know what you like, know what you enjoy talking about, know what you're good at, know what you connect with. And also be able to, and it's a mark of good leadership to be able to say, I'm also not great at this, or I don't love this, but so-and-so who's on my team or works for this other organization, they love numbers, and like they could just sit and make Excel spreadsheets for days, right? So if they're your numbers person and they can break those things down and you can sort of, merge your talents together, that makes a very compelling story, and it makes, the sort of case for how to strengthen what your ask is.
We have another question in the chat, Julio, from Jean Hernandez, and I forget your new married last name. I'm so sorry. Congratulations. I worked with Jean when I was at AIDS Alabama. Hello. But Jean says, how do we advocate for language access through storytelling? I find myself having first-generation immigrants with powerful stories living with HIV, but who don't speak English.
Thank you, Jean. That's an excellent question. It ties into a question that we received from Alberto también, que dice, Julio Fonseca, ¿es posible para tener la presentación, la inglés en español? Sí, podemos trabajar para traducirlo en casi creo que 2 semanas, los próximos. Además, esta tarde también, para la gente que son latinexes aquí, tenemos una sesión para networking que será totalmente en español a las 4. So that's for my monolingual English folks. We will, I can commit to trying to get this presentation and the materials translated within the next 2 weeks. I think that's something that we can do, getting it translated to Spanish. That there is a Latinx network session this afternoon at 4 p.m. that will be virtual as well. I think that that's a great place to talk about what communities have done and community-driven approaches. We actually have a presenter who will be talking about creating a curriculum. It's something that's been called transcreation, where you take content and instead of just doing a translation, it's created from the community perspective. So I don't have a perfect answer, Jean, for how to, advocate for storytelling, and translating storytelling, but I think that there may be folks that can provide examples of what they've done locally, et cetera, in that session. And I definitely want to stay in touch. We'll have all of your information as well to be able to share any stories or things that are sort of coming out along those lines. And sorry for my really kind of rough Spanish there for a second, but it's getting better.
I think the other question that I see in the slides or in the chat is about the slides, and all slides will be made available to attendees after AIDSWatch is complete today. So be looking out for that over the next week or so. I think that's about the turnaround time that we're expecting to get everything up and out. So be on the lookout for that. I don't see any other questions right now. Do other folks have questions?
Okay, so I see that just a couple of things really quickly. One, I see that a theme that sort of is emerging is that folks are talking about how technology and virtual technology can be overwhelming. Totally agree. I think that, don't be afraid to ask questions. Also, there's some really good tutorials that are available for free on the internet on how to use certain platforms. How to make the most of Twitter, the most of your character limits, the most of your videos, Instagram, etc. Facebook, I wanted to say something really quickly about Facebook. Facebook has changed all of their metrics recently on how they sort of measure and capture things within the last year. And so on one of the projects that I work on, we used to post very heavily on Facebook in terms of videos and stories, et cetera. And we were finding that they weren't getting the same reach that they were because of the way that the metrics had changed. So I think that a lot of things are kind of moving sort of away from the Facebook platform and into these sort of quicker, paced, platforms. Also know what you want to kind of engage on. I have no desire to do anything on Snapchat. I don't think that that well sort of positions itself to, in terms of reaching and how we want to get certain messages out, that platform maybe isn't necessarily a match for it. But if you're working with younger communities or other communities that access it more, then that might be something that you want to like look into doing like an online tutorial about.
Let's see. So we have a couple questions. One is, Susan says, I asked about TED Talks. Can we use this mode? So I think what your original question was, if I remember it correctly, is has anyone thought about using TED Talks about a specific issue and then delivering that TED Talk to all of Congress virtually? Am I capturing that question correctly, Susan? Okay, great, thank you. So TED Talks, for those who don't know, are a series of, what does that even stand for? Technology, education, and design, I think. So there is these series of talks about a specific topic, and there is this national or international TED conference, and then there are local TED gatherings like TEDx, your city name here, where people are brought in to talk about a theme or a specific topic, and then they present. I've seen TED Talks as short as 4 minutes and as long as 20. So I think that is a good medium to explore. I don't know how best to deliver that to Congress. I think where the TED Talk platform or style of delivery could come in to play in advocacy is skills building among advocates in your community. So say if I were to, if Julio and I, or if we were to turn this presentation into an 18-minute TED Talk, then it could be used as a sort of training piece for other advocates. But I don't know how we would deliver something like that to Congress. Generally, getting messages to Congress is done either in person or on the phone or through text-only digital messaging like emails and tweets and things of that nature.
Which
but this is an interesting exploration. It's not impossible, but.
Well, and we're also entering into an era of, creativity in terms of what we may need to do because the in-person visit may not be feasible for an extended period of time. So Susan, I think that you might become, a trailblazer in the 18-minute, to your legislator TED Talk. I'm looking forward to what you do. See?
Let's see. Trevon asks, if we decide to advocate online, is there a reliable place to refer people to get information that can feel more personalized? So we have a wealth of information available on AIDS United's website that also refers out to partners, whether that's other nonprofit partners or governmental partners, and that's all reliable information that is kept up to date fairly regularly. I hope that's answering what you're getting at with your question. If not, please let us know in the chat. Julio, could you take the question from Nikos? It says, does anyone know how to get engagement during COVID-19? My posts have dropped from averaging around 200 likes to like 50.
Which platform is this? Facebook?
Instagram.
Instagram. Interesting. That's a good question. I don't have a direct answer for. I'm wondering if maybe there's been a shift in metrics there because of COVID-19, or if they're maybe highlighting more COVID-19 related content based on hashtags, but I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up.
But I think something you said earlier, Julio, is particularly impactful to me, is to not necessarily gauge your post engagement based on how many reactions it receives. Because there are plenty of times where I'm scrolling past something on Instagram or Twitter that was particularly meaningful that I just may forget to press the like button, but I still saw it. There are other, if you have a business account, I think you can see more information about metrics, about what the reach is for each of your account and for each of your posts individually. And I think there are third-party tools that can do that for personal accounts. Just be safe in picking third-party tools.
Yes. We have about 4 minutes left. That hour flew by.
It really did.
There's some content and questions and folks that have offered up resources in the chat box, which we will, once we can review the recording and kind of pull those. I saw something that I really liked that somebody had said that I thought, you know, barring, well, we'll wait another minute just to see if anybody has any pressing hot topic, burning desire.
Let's see, Drew has notified us that there's a question from May about engaging youth. It says, hi, I love all this information about informing communities. What about informing youth of these advanced health topics? I have a large background in how to make quick meme commentary. Is there a way I can outsource my graphic design and comedic creative resources to inform youth?
I think yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think yes is the answer, right?
I guess it's just a matter of who would have resources and sort of the ability to do that type of distribution. Why don't you, if you shoot me an email, my email was in the slide deck, but it's it's the first letter of my first name, J, and then my last name, at Fonseca, F-O-N-S-E-C-A at AIDSUnited.org. I work on our other social sort of media outreach initiative in partnership with the CDC. So that, which I can't really talk about now because we're doing, you know, public policy and advocacy today, but we can talk about it later. Really quickly, so this quote that I think would be really, really fantastic to end on as I scroll back through comes from, I believe it was Tom. And thank you so much, everyone, for being very active in the chat and sharing your ideas, questions, and resources. We really weren't quite sure how this was going to go as it being virtual, but I think this has been phenomenal. And you know, I definitely would love to, I look forward to seeing you all again, but I'm glad we were able to kind of get this moving in this direction this way. But basically, I can't find it now. Sorry, Tom, but to paraphrase, it basically said that when talking to somebody, a policymaker or legislator for the first time, a good thing to remember is that they put their pants on just like we do, that they are people, that if you can establish that human connection, you'll find the process to be a lot less intimidating.
I think that's great. Thank you, Julio. One thing I will do is give a signal boost to the advocacy break that Drew has put into the chat a couple of times that comes with a link. Please click on that link and take a quick action before you jump into your next session at 2:45. And as always, thank you so much to our sponsors of AIDSWatch 2020, who has stuck with us in this massively rapid transition from a huge in-person event to an even larger digital event.
And thank all of you for what you do and what you are about to do as we continue to move through this interesting new era of our work.
Thanks, everyone.